I live out on the East End, yeah, in Cutchogue,
Okay.
in South Old Town. Yeah. I was at the Lindenhurst Library a couple weeks ago, and that was really a great event.
Okay. But you grew up in South Jersey?
I grew up in Haddonfield, New Jersey, and then went to college, which is South Jersey, and then I went to college out in Colorado and came back here to work for Newsday on Long Island
Funny enough, I used to live in that area.
of South Jersey.
Yeah, I lived in Westmont and then I worked in Haddonfield.
What did you do in Haddonfield?
I worked at this juice bar, organic restaurant, takeout spot right on Kings Highway.
And you grew up in Westmont?
No, I grew up here,
Yeah,
but I defected down there for a little while.
yeah. Were you born in Lindenhurst?
Yep.
It's a unique community, that's for sure.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just a little bit about your origin story, like how you got interested in writing. Were you a big reader as a kid?
Yeah, I mean, I think I read mostly history, mostly nonfiction, then came to Newsday 30 some years ago and was a long time reporter and editor there. And we can talk about it during the podcast, but when I first got to Newsday in the early 80s, my first beat was the criminal courts beat in Riverhead. And I was there one day when the detectives brought in this old man and arraigned him before the judge as a murder that had been committed in Lindenhurst in 1954.
Mhm.
And I covered that trial, and that's sort of the foundation of the novel,
Yeah.
that murder story. And it was a fascinating case, and it was a 30-year-old cold case. I was certain he was going to be acquitted. And then one day, another old person came into court, his ex-wife. He hadn't seen her in decades, and she testified to hearing water running in their bathroom one night. That would have been October 2nd, 1954. And she opened the door and he's washing blood all over the place. And he was a violent drunk and he ordered her to take the bloody clothes to the basement, and which he did, and which she did, but she was smart enough to take the bloody belt and put it in a jar and bury it in the backyard. And here we are 30 years later when it looks like this man's going to get off and he's a vicious killer. She takes the stand and tells the story about the belt in the jar. And he's convicted and sent upstate where he died in prison.
But at that point, they still didn't really have a way to see the DNA.
No, she described the story of the clothes and the blood, and her credibility was such, and plus providing the physical evidence that the jury needed. And off he went. He was a bitter, bitter drunk. I interviewed him in the Suffolk County Jail before he went upstate. I called the sheriff and asked if I could come over and talk to him. And he just, I mean, it was in a tiny little room. He was handcuffed to a chair. He was going bonkers about how his wife was a terrible human being and lied about everything. And that's when he mentions the name Hauptmann. And I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. And I said, what do you, who's this guy? And he tells me that this man's name was Rudolf Hoff, who was a German immigrant. He said that his mother in the Bronx, a German immigrant, was very close friends to Anna Hauptmann. I said, well, who's Anna Hauptmann? The widow of Richard Hauptmann, who was executed for the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh child. And that began this whole other argument, whole other topic of conversation with him. And I just felt at some point that I could take that case, look at the history of Lindenhurst a little bit. I mean, you probably can't see this, but this is a photograph taken in
Yep.
Lindenhurst in 1937,
It's a
where
famous
the
shot
Right.
right there.
the Nazis are marching down Wellwood Avenue by King Cullen.
Hmm.
I saw the picture. I remember what Hoff told me in the jail when I interviewed him, and I thought, oh, I can do something with this. And I had already written a couple of nonfiction books, but I thought, no, this maybe I can actually try fiction. So I had enough historical background for the German Bunds, which were enormous on Long Island, particularly Lindenhurst and Yaphank, where Camp Siegfried was, where they would all go out there and parade and sing their songs. I thought I could also venture into the area of Lindbergh. And there's a million books about the Lindbergh kidnapping. Many of the more recent ones really take the view that Hauptmann was framed by the state of New Jersey and executed. I share that view, but we can go into all those details when we get on the podcast. Or are we on the podcast?
We're rolling.
Oh yeah,
We've been we've been recording the whole
oh,
time,
good.
but
So I'm glad
Yeah,
to,
we
to
kind
be
of just
on
roll
with,
right into it. Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad to be
So,
on with you guys.
So yeah, going back a little bit, I assume that's your first experience with Lindenhurst and learning more about our history and particularly the drinking culture here.
Well, what really got me interested covering the trial, so that would have been 83, 84, somewhere in there. And I'm sitting right behind this guy in the courtroom, and he's a big, violent man. And the testimony is that in the early 1980s, he went into a bar in Levittown and tried to pick up this woman and got her into his car. And he said to her, "If you don't do what I tell you, I'll do to you what I did to that woman in Lindenhurst." So she got out of the car, she escaped the guy, and the next morning had the presence of mind to call the Suffolk County Homicide Squad in Yaphank and said, "I don't know whether this makes any sense or not, but this is what the guy said. I'll do to you what I did to that woman in Lindenhurst." So a young detective started going through the archive, and he finds there's an unsolved case from late September, happened to be the first night of the World Series, the night that Willie Mays caught that incredible ball at the warning track. And it involved a woman from Lindenhurst named Catherine Ann Dam, who was in the Alcove Bar and Grill right there on West Hoffman Avenue. It's not there anymore, but that's where it was. It was there until, because I used to go down there when I was at Newsday just to look at the bar, and it was still there maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, just one block west of Wellwood, just on the railroad tracks there, West Hoffman. And so Catherine,
So is that what became the Rail House?
I'm not
Corner
sure
of
what's there
Broadway?
now. It's one block in,
that that is the rail house is east of Wellwood. So is it on the north or south side of the train tracks?
just south on the south side of the railroad tracks, one block
Right.
in from Wellwood.
Maybe that
And it
was
was
Duke's.
this,
So it might have been what was the Station Cafe on High Street, like right there.
yeah.
That would be, yeah. Or what's the other one that was like a supposedly a speakeasy where Restorations is now? I think it
Well,
used to be
the
called
alcove, the alcove was an incredible dive, and it was a kind of a German immigrant hangout.
yeah.
Why Catherine Ann Dam,
Uh-huh.
who lived just a few blocks away, didn't have a car? She went there on that night to just sit there and get bombed.
Yeah.
And he picks her up, puts her in a car.
Hmm.
I'll drive you home. But instead, they go up Wellwood Avenue, just south of the railroad tracks where those new cemeteries are in. And he literally ripped her to pieces. The testimony at the trial was wicked. And I used a lot of that language in the novel as well.
So
So,
right. Yeah. It's a bit I listened to the audiobook, so it's a bit jarring when you hear that, you know what I mean, them explaining the nature of the crime without giving anything away. But
and I was fascinated by the testimony. I was fascinated by the alcove bar. I would go down there. It was always shuttered every time I went down there, even during the trial. So that was the 80s. And it was just a
Yeah.
dive where you could get a 50-cent beer and get shit faced, or excuse me, get drunk and go nuts. And Hoff's in there getting bombed. This woman is in there getting drunk, and he kills her. And the testimony was fascinating because I couldn't figure out why 30 years would go by before you made an arrest in this case. What did you need to make an arrest? And the testimony in the
that's the
trial,
question I had. Sorry, how old was he at that point?
I had the
he
same question.
he was then
Yeah.
58, 59,
Okay.
and just a
Okay.
violent drunk. And I kept wondering, why wasn't he arrested that night, for heaven's sakes? He drives his car off the
Mhm.
North Wellwood into the field. There were tire tracks, there was everything. And it turns out in the testimony that Gurley Hoff, that's what his then wife, later his ex-wife, who testified, Gurley had a friendship, is how they described it, with a Babylon Town cop who lived on their street in Lindenhurst. And that cop told Hoff's wife, "Tell him not to talk on the phone. We have a tap on it."
Mm.
And essentially that Babylon town cop protected him from getting arrested, which I think is really scandalous. In later years, that cop became a really high-ranking, when the county police department was formed in 59, 1960. He moved up to that. But the truth of what happened that, after the murder did not come out until the trial in the 1980s. So he was safe from being prosecuted. But that's why the 30 years went by. But again, to me, when I saw that photograph of the Nazis marching down Wellwood Avenue in 1937, then I started reading about Camp Siegfried out in Yaphank, and then I'm remembering this guy going, Richard Hauptmann was framed, just like I was framed. He kept telling me, and again at that time I didn't know what he was
Mhm.
talking about.
And do you also think that his wife held out for that long because she was afraid of him?
I think the most logical way I could look at her when she took the stand was that she was absolutely deathly afraid of him. He
Yeah,
beat the hell out of her all the time, which probably explains why she maybe had an interest in some other person on their street. But
especially a
regardless,
cop. Yeah,
and he happened to be a cop.
yeah,
And they didn't exactly arrest Hobb for beating up his wife. But
yeah.
she was so scared of him that during the trial of Hoff, when it really looked like he was going to get off for this 30-year-old murder, there was a Suffolk County homicide cop named George Latchford, and he could smell what was coming, a possible acquittal. And he kept going to the house in Lindenhurst where she still lived and said, Mrs. Hoff, you got to help us. You must know something. And she kept rebuffing him out of just abject fear that if the guy got off, he'd kill her. And then maybe his fourth or fifth visit to the house when he said, look, he's gonna be acquitted. You got to help us. That's when she told the bloody clothes story, and that was enough.
Yeah.
And she later, I tried to track her after the trial. She ended up living out in Texas. They had two boys. They're somewhere on Long Island. Catherine Dams has a son named Stephen Dam. I believe he still might live in Lindenhurst. I think he was a
Hmm.
contractor there. Someone at the Lindenhurst Library, when I spoke a couple of weeks ago, said he was a pretty good contractor there for a while. But, he lost his mother. The two boys ended up having a father who was a brutal murderer who died in prison. And while he was in prison, he kept bombarding me with these letters. Come up and see me. I was framed. And I'd had enough of him sitting in that jail. I didn't want to go up and see him again. Plus, he wasn't going to tell me anything new anyway. He wasn't going to confess to it.
Right.
But Lindenhurst's history is a character in this book, in the novel.
Yeah.
It's pretty much a character.
Absolutely.
And that's what I think makes it so interesting. And since I've been around talking about it, recently I had a guy come up to me um, who said, Steve, when I was a kid, my friends and I would go down to Wellwood Avenue and those Nazis would march down with their big swastika flags and we would spit on them. And they'd be singing their Nazi songs and we'd be singing the Star Spangled Banner. And I think one aspect of this book that I would hope might be an afterthought in Lindenhurst is for the village to kind of go back into its past, do some study, look for some records. I mean, the photograph that I just showed you guys, which I showed at the library that night, and you could hear the gasps all over the room. That's a real photograph. That's Wellwood
Yep.
Avenue. They're uniformed. They're in all their Nazi uniforms. Who were these people?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
if
they
you
were just people living in the community.
there were people living in the community, and someone out there is a grandson or a granddaughter of one of those people in the parade. And it would be
Mhm.
interesting to explore, again, not in any kind of recriminatory way, but just explore the mood of a German Hamlet. I mean, after all, you guys were called Breslau for a bunch of years before it even became
Mhm.
first. You were a German immigrant enclave. But how do they explain it today? And what are their thoughts about it? I mean, the Lindenhurst Village historian, if there is such a person, really needs to start looking into this.
Yeah. Another interesting thing, this was really only 80 years ago. So many people didn't
Exactly.
speak English yet.
Yeah, exactly. And when I look at this picture and I'm looking at it now, I'm thinking, I can see their faces of these guys. There's someone who, is there still a Lindenhurst Star newspaper? If
No,
they could,
No.
if they, no, that went out of business.
no.
If someone could publish this newspaper or put it online somewhere, like whatever the Lindenhurst
They have
line,
files. The library has it.
and go,
Yeah, the
wait a
library
second.
has it digitized.
Yeah, oh, that picture's digitized. Oh, I love
Well,
it.
I've seen that picture digitized before, but they have actual issues of the Lindenhurst Star, like archived and digitized. So you can
So
look at them as PDFs.
someone should be able to look at that and go, wait a second, that's my grandfather, and
Right.
start a
Yeah.
conversation about it. But that's the backdrop, the actual murder that took place, the murder of Catherine Ann Dam, a resident of Lindenhurst. Rudolph Hoff, who lived in Lindenhurst, killed her and got away with it for 30 years.
So a few things. Number one, there is footage of that World Series on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it.
I've seen it. It's a
Uh,
great catch, isn't it?
yeah. And okay, so this is the early 80s that you come to know about this case. And you've had a few books in between, and
Yes.
obviously a lot of journalism and reporting in between. But were you starting the seeds of the book even mentally at that time?
That's a great question. I just remember leaving the jail after I interviewed this guy, and when he brought up Houtman, and I went back to I think I went to the Riverhead Library to just look up the name. There's no internet then, and I realized that he was talking about this incredible case that occurred March 1st, 1932. The the Lindbergh house is fully occupied. The lights are all on. It's only about 8 o'clock at night. Lindbergh's there, his family's there, the house servants are there. Someone drives up to the house, takes a really crude ladder, puts it up against the side of the house, just happens to pick the very window that's the nursery in a big house, just happens to be the window that has a broken shutter, so you can't lock it from the inside. Climbs up and steals the kid. That's their story. It's preposterous. And 2 years later, Richard Hauptman, living in the Bronx, gets some money from his friend Isidore Fish, who I think is probably the guilty party here. And it's part of the ransom money. And Hauptman goes through a Bronx gas station and buys $10 worth of gas with ransom money. And they were gold certificates. They were easy to see, and you were supposed to turn them in during the Roosevelt administration. And the gas station attendant was ticked. He thought, this isn't worth $10 anymore. And he wrote the license plate down. You see the newspaper coverage. The moment Hauptman was arrested, the New York media went crazy. Kill the German, kill the Kraut. I mean, you see headlines that are just unbelievable. They were so determined to pay homage to Lindbergh as a national hero that once they found the guy with the ransom money, even though ransom money had been turned into various banks all over the city, but they got this guy, and he fit that description of the other, the immigrant, the ignorant German. We just went to war with these people. We don't like them. And he had some ransom money. He said, "Yeah, I got it from my friend Isidore Fish." At that point, the New Jersey State Police did absolutely everything that Lindbergh told them to do. So that when the ransom money was passed to someone in a cemetery in the Bronx, Lindbergh said, "I don't want any cops around." I mean, the way this man acted, even J. Edgar Hoover said he was very suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
But Hauptman was framed from the moment they found him. And the New York newspapers just really pushed the idea that this Kraut, this nasty German immigrant, killed a 2-year-old child.
But at the
That's
same time, Lindbergh was a huge Nazi sympathizer.
that the part that I certainly lean on in the book, and you can find it in different places, but it was not talked about at the time,
Yeah.
is Lindbergh, even after Hitler comes to power in 1933, Lindbergh's in Germany getting awards from Hitler and Goering. He is full
I was
blown.
going to say, I watched a lot of the book reminded me of a HBO series that I watched that was based on a book called Once
Which
Upon
one?
a Time in America. I don't know if
Oh
you're
yeah,
familiar with it.
right.
It's based on the book Once Upon a Time, and it's the same name, Once Upon a Time in America. But it basically shows like an alternate history of him running for president and the whole country kind of being pro-Nazi. The Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden is featured in the movie, and it's all from the point of view of a Jewish family living in New Jersey who has to make a decision to leave their house in New Jersey because it's not safe for them anymore.
Yeah, it's a Philip Roth novel that he turns Lindbergh into running for president. But the
Yes.
thing about Lindbergh that fits perfectly into real life history, but also the plot of this novel, and particularly after Hauptmann had mentioned his fascination with Hauptmann, is that Lindbergh is 100% pro-Nazi. There's no doubt about
Yes.
this. He
Uh-huh.
was also, it's really important to also understand, he was 100% pro-eugenics. And eugenics, if you know the history of Cold Spring Laboratory and all the
Yes.
eugenics experiments they were doing. So you have someone who believes he's got a son who doesn't live up to his Nazi ideal, happens to disappear from the house in a completely fabricated case. I've talked to a cop in New Jersey who studied the case. He said, Steve, there's no doubt that somebody walked that child right out the front door.
Yeah.
Uh, and the way Lindbergh behaves afterwards. But the most incriminating thing for me, and I use this angle in the book as well, and this research has been done by a retired judge out in California. At the Rockefeller Institute in Manhattan was a researcher named Alex Carrel. Those of you who read the book can remember his appearance in the novel. He was a Frenchman, extremely pro-Nazi and pro-eugenics. He's quoted as saying things like Down syndrome kids should be gassed. That's Lindbergh's research partner. Now, if
Right.
you're judged by the company you keep, man, that is really bad.
Uh-huh.
So to me, Carell seems like the likely candidate who then suggests a way for Lindbergh to get out of his troubles. And but just before the war broke out, just before France was occupied, Carell went back. And I saw some coverage in France that had he not died during the war, he would have been prosecuted for war crimes. But Lindbergh's, I mean, there's three things that are really haunting. Lindbergh's relationship with Carell, who was a full-blown eugenicist, Lindbergh's Nazi ties, and the Lindenhurst community, which was so entranced at some point in the 30s by the whole Nazi movement in Germany. I mean, they were very, very pro-Hitler.
Yeah. And Lindbergh himself flying back and forth to Europe, starting other families, allegedly.
Yeah, that didn't even come out till probably 10, 15 years ago. I think at some point, Anne Lindbergh, who was a wonderfully beautiful writer, his wife, probably no longer believed the Hauptmann story anymore. They seem to have been apart for a while. So what's Lindbergh doing? What country does he pick to spread his seed? Germany. With three different women, six children. So everything points to this guy being, and if you remember, there's a quote in the novel at the very end where FDR, actual quote, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, writes a letter to Henry Morgenthau, his finance secretary, and says, if I die tomorrow, I want you to know Lindbergh is a Nazi, not a sympathizer, not pretending to be, not a wannabe, is a Nazi. So Roosevelt really was turned off by this guy. And then we'll also see in the book, you have this mysterious table that shows up in a barn in New Jersey in the 1940s with a full-blown in German confession on it. And the curator of the archive in Trenton, the State Police Archive, sees the table. He takes the 12 ransom notes that someone wrote to Lindbergh, I want $50,000. And they had these funny holes and circles on them. He lays it up to the bolt holes on the bottom of that table. Again, in German, a confession. I was one of the blah, blah, blah. And the holes all line up, meaning that the weird design, if you go online and look at the weird design on the ransom letters, was made on the bottom of that table. That was found in 1949. Did New Jersey do anything about it after they found it? Did they go back and maybe rethink what they did? No. And to this day, there's now a movement in New Jersey to not necessarily reopen the case, but to take whatever evidence is still in storage, let's say the ransom envelopes. Can we extract any DNA from it? Can anything be found on the ladder? They found no fingerprints on it in 1930, which is pretty weird. Years later, when they had a different way to look at it, they found a bunch of fingerprints, none of which were Hauptmann. But for some, just about 3 weeks ago, a group of lawyers tried to get them to allow DNA evidence, and the state of New Jersey said no. For some reason, and it's probably because of the execution, the state of New Jersey won't go near this thing.
That's bad PR, I guess.
Yeah, bad PR. The names are still well known.
Yeah.
Uh, Wilentz was the prosecutor. His children still have a law firm there. So unfortunately, all these years later, the state of New Jersey doesn't want to dig into this thing. It's really a shame.
So another thing I was going to ask you, just in the process of writing the book, I know there's no way of knowing what people actually said to each other at the time. So how do you go about writing dialogue and making it seem authentic?
It's a really, really good point. And I'll begin it by saying, or answer it by saying that going from nonfiction to fiction is a leap that it's like across trying to, broad jump the Grand Canyon or something.
Yeah.
Here you're used, 30 years at Newsday, 3 nonfiction books where you have records, you take what you can get that's right there in front of you. When you go to write a novel and you're going to have actual events as part of it, the rest you have to make up. So, for example, at all the talks I've given, particularly the Lindenhurst Library talk, people would say, well, the guy that got run over by the train, was that a real death, or that's a different one? Or how did you know about this, or how did you know about that? But to get back to your point, you got to write dialogue that fits the moment you're in, and it has to work and it has to sound real. And it's hard to pull off. And it took me 8, maybe 10 years to write that damn thing. Because I was working at full time at Newsday and later at a little weekly out east. But just trying to figure out fiction. For example, the biggest difference is that in journalism or nonfiction, you explain something. Gee, why did he do this or why did he do that? In fiction, you don't explain anything. And the best example I can think of is, think of 2 actors on a stage in front of an audience and they're having an argument. Neither of those actors stops, walks to the edge of the stage and explains to the audience, oh, you're probably wondering why I don't like my brother. Well, it's because this happened when I was 10. They just argue. And you and the audience have to kind of, gee, I wonder what they're arguing about, or what's the big deal. In fiction, you don't explain. So the little stick it note on my desk the whole 8 years was, stop explaining anything. And when I finally had a draft and I went through it the first time, I probably took a third of it out. It's a big leap, but to get to your point, dialogue has to sound real, and you have to be able to represent people. And the other big leap for me was creating a character who could carry the story, and that's Paul Byrne. Paul Byrne's the detective, grew up in fictional character, grew up in Lindenhurst, German father, as you know, there's a backstory there. A mother that when Paul was in high school, his mother seems to have disappeared. His father kept saying, he left us, she left us, she left us. He hated his father. He's heartbroken about his mother, and he enlists in the United States Navy. Again, a fictional character. But what does he do? He goes on a submarine. The submarine gets sunk by the Japanese. He's put in a camp. He comes home just a busted, broken man to live in the little village where he grew up with a father he couldn't stand and a mother that's gone. And he becomes the police chief because they tell him nothing ever happens here. Don't worry about it. It's just a no-show job. And then boom, you find a dead woman in a field north of Lindenhurst. And I thought, well, how am I going to do this? How am I going to tell this story? And I thought I needed a second character. And that became Doc Liebman, if you remember from the story. Doc has his own backstory. He's a German immigrant, Jewish, has a funeral home in Lindenhurst. So he's the guy they call and say, hey, somebody died at a nursing home, but he's never seen a murder victim before. But he has a story that would make Paul's look pretty easy, even though Paul was in a camp. So Doc becomes that counterpoint for me where Paul doesn't know what to do, but Doc's saying, well, first off, you got to stop drinking. And I don't really care about your problems with your old man. You got to focus on this case. Forget your old man. But then all these lines begin to come together towards the end, and you realize that the father's got some answers, some questions to answer too.
I was wondering, did you speak any German beforehand, or did you just write it in English and have those lines translated?
I didn't speak a word of it, but I wanted enough lines in it that I could use Google Translate and make it sound authentic. And what's really interesting, John, is that when the audiobook was sold, the audio company called me and said, this is going to be kind of difficult because you've got sentences in German. But she said, we're trying out three actors in New York, and we want you to pick the one you think does it the best. And you heard the audiobook, John, right? I mean,
Yes,
that guy does a great job in that audiobook.
he does an absolutely great job.
So he could go from Paul talking in English to his father and his father's answering back in German, and it sounded perfectly real.
Yeah.
So to me, the audiobook
Mhm.
is the best part of this.
And that was through the publisher. They auditioned actors for you.
Yeah, the audio publisher, the Pegasus, the hardback publisher, sold the audio rights to another company, and they then have the task of finding a reader. I asked to do it myself, but then they said, I don't think that's a good idea because you're not going to be able to pronounce the German sentences
Yeah.
correctly. So I said, fine, send me the three you have. And I listened to all three. And the guy was just a no-brainer. He was just perfect as a reader. And I've had since people have contacted me saying, man, I love the audiobook of this book. He's really good. And I've done some readings. I did one in Babylon at a bookstore in Babylon. And what was interesting about that one, Anthony and John, is that I did a little talk, and there was a woman in the front row who got really upset. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Well," she said, "I found this story very troubling." And I said, "Well, you mean the crime, or what do you mean?" She said, "No, the echoes to today."
Mm.
And I said, I hadn't even thought of that until she mentioned it. I said, "You mean what's going on politically today, Charlottesville, Virginia, with the Nazis marching around?"
Yep.
And she was an older woman. She grew up in Babylon. She said, "Did anybody ever think you'd see a swastika in this country?" And I said, "No, I don't think anybody ever thought that." But to her, the aspect of the book that really bothered her was that it felt very current. And that's interesting, writing about a 1954 murder, novelizing a 30 year, a 1954 murder, almost 75 years ago, and having a woman say, it reminds me of what's going on now.
Another thing I was going to mention back to Paul and Doc, it seems like those two characters are really like kind of grappling with their past through their careers
Yeah.
in a way.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And to me, Doc, like Paul, is kind of the iceberg principle of writing, where you see just the top of the iceberg and there's something huge underneath that you don't actually get at.
Yeah.
And Doc's got this horrible past. He and his brother were in Auschwitz. They got here to be safe. Turns out that it might not work out for them. They end up leaving in the book. But without Doc, Paul's hopeless. He can't stop drinking. He's
Yeah.
obsessed with where his mother is. And of course, he figures out where she is, as you remember in the book. But to me, Doc is a fascinating character who wants to fit in, but he doesn't quite fit in. He's sort of treated like a foreigner, and but he still loves it here. He still wants to be here. And
Mm.
without him, I don't think Paul would have possibly have cracked that case. And it's really Doc telling him, God, stop with all these side roads you're going down. You can worry about your father later. You got a woman dead in a field who's had her insides ripped out. And when I pulled the archive from the DA's office about what actually happened to Catherine Ann Dam, that's what happened to her. Hoff really lifted her, ripped her apart.
Yeah.
It's a
Brutal.
brutal crime.
Mm.
But again, not to preach to the village of Lindenhurst, but take that picture of 1937 and just grow it. Try to find out what did happen here then. What 80% of the population wasn't even around then. What did happen then? How prevalent was? Who are these people? Does anyone have a relative they could talk to us about these people? Some of them were arrested once the war was declared. Some of them were rounded up by the FBI. And of course, remember the rallies in Madison Square Garden, where
Yeah.
you'd get 60,000 screaming Nazis. You can see I think you mentioned it, John. You can actually see the the footage inside where these
Yeah.
Nazis are hailing Hitler, hail Hitler. And I mean, you just can't believe what you're looking at. And I guess that's what that woman at the Babylon bookstore was talking about when she said it just seems current to me, not just a 30-year-old murder story.
Yeah. So your first fiction book, are you
Yeah,
planning
first
any more?
novel. Well, I'm hoping, what I'm really hoping for, Anthony, is that it sells enough that I can do a sequel with the same detective
Okay.
and continue the series in the same time frame, the 50s, 60s, in Lindenhurst, with Paul Byrne. And I sort of have a lot of it figured out what I can do. I think it's important that it also be seeded with things that actually happened, so that when you're reading the novel, you go, hey, wait a second, I remember that. What's going on here? Um, so I'm working on that. I'm hoping to get it done by the fall, but you know what? I might be wasting my time. Fiction's really hard to sell, and it's a business decision at this point. If Pegasus does okay with the ruins, they might say, oh, okay, Wick, we'll take a sequel. Or they might say, hey, the first one didn't sell that well, so why should we give you money for a second one? But I'm going to push it. I'm going to work hard at it. I've had great reactions. I think the best one really was the Lindenhurst Library. That audience was absolutely wonderful. Many of them knew some of the story. One woman in the back said, I knew Catherine Ann Dam's son, the builder, the contractor. It really rang to them like this is a story about us. And it's not. It's set in 1954, and everyone in the room was born well after that. But Lindenhurst is a fascinating case. I used to go down there a lot when I was a reporter because Newsday was just up the street on Pine Lawn Road.
Yeah.
I used to go down there and talk to people all the time. Lindenhurst has always fascinated me. It's really classic Long Island, kind of classic working class. Um, Everything you think about when you think about Long Island, and a tight community too. Someone at the reading and at the library said, you can take the person out of Lindenhurst, but you can't take Lindenhurst out of the person. And I hadn't heard that
Yeah.
before,
Yeah.
but it's a special place.
Yeah. So we always close out every interview we do on our podcast with the question, if you could describe Lindenhurst to someone who's never been here, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to drive down Wellwood Avenue, get some pizza, definitely go to the library. That's a really impressive library, and go all the way down to the bayfront and see, what Superstorm Sandy did down there, which is pretty amazing. But try to understand that this was a German community called Breslau
Yeah.
up until, the early 20th century. And it just, to me, Lindenhurst just has a lot of character. It just has a lot of character. It knows who it is. And I'm hoping that enough people will read the novel and say, how can we learn some more about this place? That would be to me, that'd be successful.
Great. So before we let you go, just let everyone know where they can find you online, order the book,
Yeah,
all
they
that
can
info.
go to stevewickbooks.com is my website for the book. All the bookstores have it. Barnes and Noble has it. All the independent stores have it. Obviously, Amazon has it. If you go to stevewickbooks.com, the good reason to go there is that you'll see the original story that I wrote for Newsday in 86, 87 about the Hoff case. So if you go to that site, you can actually print it out. You can see the story. I had it here somewhere. And you can see what I wrote that I then held on to all those years, hoping I could novelize it. But there's a photograph I took out of the DA's archive of that body in the field off Wellwood Avenue. It's a really classic photo. So go to stevewickbooks.com and you can see the original story.